You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Bewick. News, views and interviews in association with FE News. Hello everyone, I'm Tom Bewick and welcome to another informative episode of Skills World Live. I found myself Googling on this day in history earlier, which beats Googling my own name for a change. Anyway, to my surprise, I found that on this day, the 12th of May in 1820, the English nurse Florence Nightingale was born. In fact, she was born in Florence, Italy, the birthplace, of course, of the European Renaissance, and perhaps why her parents called her Florence. Today is also International Nurses Day, so it really is a dual celebration all round. And haven't we just, during the coronavirus crisis, come to truly understand and appreciate the work of our frontline health professionals? Florence Nightingale gave the world so much when she was alive. The lady with the lamp, as she was known in the hospital field stations of the Crimea, would go on to be a great educationalist and social reformer of her age. In 1860, she was instrumental in setting up the first Nightingale School of Nursing at St Thomas's in London, the same hospital, incidentally, where the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was treated for the virus. Of course, all around the country, there are at least 7 temporary Nightingale hospitals, and one has to wonder what the old lady would make of such an engineering feat. The average time from announcement to building and equipping the Nightingale hospitals took less than 2 weeks. There is critical bed capacity and room for over 3,000 patients. Thankfully, there's not been much use for them yet, as the efforts by all of us to flatten the curve and keep COVID-19 under control has largely worked. The big unknown still is whether that progress can be sustained, and we can avoid a second spike in the infection rate. It is why a phased approach back to some semblance of normality is still looking months, not weeks away. So it is right that we dedicate tonight's show looking at potentially one very painful aftermath of the impact of this pandemic and all these continued lockdown measures. On a day when the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has announced the partial extension of the government's job retention scheme, we'll be asking the question, could youth unemployment hit 50% of the workforce in the coming months? And if it does, what should the policy response be? On tonight's show, we've got labour market experts galore, as well as guests who are working on the front line of this massive challenge now facing our country. But first, let's find out what's making the news headlines in your skills world this evening. The Department for Education has clarified the position on pupils returning to educational settings from the 1st of June. The government in England is expecting all 16 to 19 vocational students, including those studying BTECs, as well as GCSE and A-level learners, to return to college from the start of next month. The guidance released by the DfE said that they were expecting colleges to supplement online delivery of learning with some face-to-face contact with years 10 and 12 students. Further government guidance on the phased reopening of educational settings, including FE colleges, is expected next week. In other news, a revised apprenticeship framework to include an advanced dental nursing pathway has recently been approved by the Welsh Government. The new pathway was developed by Health Education and Improvement Wales, National Health Service and independent dental employers, along with other stakeholders including professional and regulatory bodies, training providers and awarding bodies. The All Wales Faculty for Dental Care Professionals, a body funded by Welsh Government and hosted by Bangor University, also significantly contributed to the new apprenticeship pathway. And finally, a visually impaired student at Cambridge Regional College has set up a community radio initiative as part of his Level 3 in Creative Media Production and Technology qualification. Matthew O'Leary produced the weekly shows called The Last Whistle, which finished airing in late 2019. The studio mixing desk was labelled with Braille to enable Matt to control the show himself, and learning support mentor Glenn became co-host, offering assistance as required. The budding radio presenter has done so well that his music lecturer, Ben Carr, says Matthew is already working on his last major project, which will enable him to progress to a broadcast degree programme in September. And Matt, if you're listening, perhaps we could make use of your brilliant skills on this show. That's all your Skills World news from fenews.co.uk. Contact us at Skills World Live. Email skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter @Tom Bewick, @FENews. Use the hashtag SkillsWorld. Call us on 02032 900 111. That's 02032 900 111.
It's getting closer to midnight. I try to get closer to you. Drinking courage from my red cup now. I will soon make a move. Ooh, I can taste it. The bittersweetness of taking a shot. A risk worth taking. If it's a shot at love.
Adore You. That's Wake Up with What 3RS. Taken, of course, from the Skills World Live team's favourite independent music site of choice, epidemicsound.com. Tonight's big debate is on the theme of will youth unemployment hit 50% post-COVID-19. Of course, there is nothing new about young people being on the brunt of poor labour market prospects when an economy hits the skids. Listeners of my age or generation will remember the end of post-war full employment years. and the massive youth unemployment that followed in the 1980s. It led a lot of people at the time to talk about the long-lasting scarring effects and a lost generation. Unlike past economic shocks, however, this one has been caused by biological factors, not financial ones. Neither is this the huge industrial restructuring which took place in the 1980s. But what we are all now and about to live through is no Thatcherite revolution, and neither is it the Great Recession of the mid-2000s. In reality, with such a massive decline in consumer demand, not least because large parts of the UK and global economy have been ordered into hibernation these past 2 months, this will ultimately translate into a huge financial crisis and potentially a second Great Depression. Of course, governments appear to have learnt the lessons of these past depressions, and great minds like John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman, both these economists, from differing philosophical perspectives, recognise that it is precisely at times like these that governments have to be really active, pumping the money and credit supply to businesses and individuals. Frankly, borrowing whatever it takes and keeping some kind of demand going until the private sector can fully operate once again. The big unknown is how many young and older people will be unemployed and how many businesses will have failed. They just don't quite know that yet. In this year alone, experts estimate that there are 640,000 young people at risk of being made unemployed. Indeed, it has led to one major think tank, the Resolution Foundation, to rush out a detailed report analysing and warning of the looming challenge. The coronavirus class of 2020 potentially faces the worst employment prospects of any generation in recent living memory. After the break, I'll be talking to tonight's special guest and author of the Resolution Foundation's report about the scale of the challenge that is about to engulf us. I'll be asking her what can be done to prevent the youth unemployment rate from hitting or even exceeding 50%. Don't go away, folks. I'll be talking to Kathleen Henehan very shortly. You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Bewick.
Put your body on the kitchen table and move the dishes to the side. Yeah. Girl, you always tend to drive me crazy, looking at me with those eyes. Yeah. Put some music on, turn the lights down low, throw the pillows off the bed, blow the candles out. Shirt you gave me, 'cause it reminds me of the times when I was down and you were there to save me, telling me that I'll be fine. Put some music on, turn the lights down low, throw the pillows off the bed, blow the candles out, move your body slow. If you got something on your mind, I'ma try to help you let it go. Try to help you let it go. Try to help you let it. If you got something on your mind, I'ma try to help you let it go. You got something on your mind, I'ma try to help you let it go.
Let It Go. Go by Deans with Andy Delos Santos. Another one of those tracks from epidemicsound.com. Now to kick off tonight's big debate about youth unemployment, I'm delighted that Kathleen Henehan, who's a research and policy analyst at the Resolution Foundation, has taken the time to join the show this evening. Good evening, Kathleen.
Hi there.
Hi, thank you so much for coming on. Now, look, given the Chancellor's announcement, that's sort of hot off the press really, today about the extension of the job retention scheme, I mean, just be good just to get your quick sort of reaction to that. I mean, presumably, given what you've written in your report, which we're about to talk about, you think that's a good thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's right to give firms some certainty that this will continue for a bit longer, and obviously, furloughed staff as well. One of the things that's also really helpful is that there's partial. They're going to consider some element of partial furlough for workers as well, which is a really good thing because we know that there are people who are working reduced hours, and without some sort of partial furlough assistance, they might be better off just not working at all. So obviously it's great to see that flexibility in there.
Okay. Now, look, tonight's focus is about this looming challenge of youth unemployment in Britain. I mean, it was already at nearly 12% for 18 to 24-year-olds even before COVID-19 struck. So your research suggests that in previous economic downturns and recessions, the youth rate can be up to 3 or 4 times higher than the general adult rate of unemployment. Do you think that makes a 50% youth unemployment rate, which is just staggering, isn't it? But do you think it makes that rate this year quite likely?
It's really tough to tell. One of the things that we looked at in our report was what the OBR projected for the overall, so the 16 plus unemployment rate in the country. And in the past, even though the youth unemployment rate is much higher than that, the overall unemployment rate, in proportional terms, it ticks up at about the same rate during an economic crisis. So we sort of applied OBR projections, which have us at about a 10% overall unemployment rate by Q2 2020, so just about now. And we then applied that proportionate increase, I think it's like 157% increase or something, to the 18 to 24-year-old rate. So not strictly the youth rate, which is 16 to 24. But anyways, we got to about 27%. Now, obviously, that's just in this quarter, and this is just based upon projections that, frankly, were made back in April. So that's not to say that it couldn't be slightly lower, but I think playing it safe, that's not to say that it actually couldn't be quite a bit higher.
Yeah. Well, look, we could tell you're a labour market economist, indeed a graduate at London School of Economics. So let's talk about the figures just a little bit more closely. I mean, you're estimating this year that there will be around 640,000 young people potentially at risk of unemployment because they're essentially the class of 2020 and, they're leaving the education system. I mean, I thought you did some really detailed analysis looking at the impact of, for example, different qualification levels and the future prospects of both graduates and non-graduates in the labour market, even after a big economic shock. Just tell us more about that, because in a sense, not all unemployed young people are equal, are they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really important point. So, big picture, just looking at what happened in past crises, the overall number of 18 to 24-year-olds that could find themselves unemployed is massive. An extra 600,000, that brings us up to about 1 million 18 to 24-year-olds, which is something that, frankly, we haven't seen the likes of since the 1980s. So already that's really important. But actually, recessions tend to hit different types of people differently. And within that, qualifications play an absolutely massive role. So in starting our research, we first just looked back and said, well, what happened in the past recession, comparing people who left education during the recession against those who left just after it. And actually, even as many as 3-4 years down the line, there are gaps in unemployment between people who, had the misfortune of leaving during a recession and people who didn't. But actually, those gaps are a lot bigger for non-graduates.
I mean, you sort of refer to that, don't you, as the scarring effect. So there's the immediate crisis, there's the unemployment, which is really the outcome of a huge collapse in economic demand. Then things hopefully and eventually start to pick up. That's certainly what's happened in past recessions. But what your research, I think, really shows very starkly, frankly, is how, if you're just happy to be born in a certain generation and you go through a recession, depending on how deep that recession is and how severe it is, that can have lasting effects, can't it, on your future pay prospects and indeed where you eventually end up in the labour market.
Yeah, and one of the things that happened last time around that I think is particularly worrying is that because there were just so many fewer vacancies opening up, you tended to see non-graduates were scarred more in terms of just employment. They were less likely to get a job upon leaving, and then less likely to have a job than their counterparts who left later for many years. Now, graduates saw a little bit less of that employment scarring, though they did see them. But what essentially happened was graduates were able to fill non-graduate roles that in better economic times, non-graduates would have been able to enter into a lot more easily. And so graduates tended to experience a little bit more pay scarring down the line. Like that's kind of the element of the crisis that affected them more. But non-graduates were struggling to just get any job in the first place because they were sort of squeezed out. And the worrying thing this time around, of course, is that so many of those jobs that graduates went into aren't available right now because they're in shut down sectors.
Yeah, again, point very well made in your report. A very substantial chunk of graduates and indeed undergraduates when they're studying will be in the hospitality, retail sort of sectors of the economy, either on a part-time basis or initially on a full-time basis when they graduate. I mean, your policy recommendations suggest, it appears to me anyway, a massive expansion of further and higher education places to sort of kind of ride out the worst of the downturn, I think is how you describe it. I mean, do you think, though, that just sort of mopping up the unemployment challenge in that way is just storing up bigger problems further down the line?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think just, it is a problem in the sense of, there just will be young people who don't fancy another year of education. And, while a lot of young people will benefit from the skills and education that they would get by staying in another year. So, frankly, there might be other young people who really just want to get on with it. And even if they do stay in, it's only allowing them to sort of ride out the worst of the storm and not have a big, gap in their resume during which time they're unemployed and, all those negative things. And so fine, I think that could be helpful. But of course, I think what you're probably getting at, which is right, is that so we hold everyone back for a year, the economy recovers, and you have this, glut of young people all competing over these few vacancies. And yeah, I mean, it's a real problem. I think you're right. I think that, this sort of helping people stay on in education, needs to be balanced against some sort of, demand side policy on the labour market side, just, trying.
I mean, I think that's really what I was hinting at. I mean, again, when you look at sort of past recessions and the response of governments, particularly Scandinavian countries, they've tended to combine, if you like, the sort of educational holding pen with, for example, active labour market policies and indeed policies to encourage startups and entrepreneurship, because one thing is very clear, isn't it, about this crisis? We're not going to go back to any kind of business as usual or any sense of what was normal perhaps before the whole crisis struck. I mean, there are going to have to be some innovations, not least, I'm sure, in the healthcare sector and in virtual learning and other sorts of IT-based approaches. Now, look, final question. I mean, you make the obvious point about how apprenticeships have already been curtailed for young people in recent years. Tell us what you think the DFE and the Institute for Apprenticeships and indeed the devolved administrations, because it's not just about England, what should those governments, administrations, agencies be doing in policy terms, do you think, to ensure that employers can both retain and recruit apprentices?
Yeah. I mean, if I'm completely honest, it's a really tricky one, and we've sort of gone around the houses on it. I think, in the first instance, it's fixed the long-term problem, which is, consider limiting, in England at least, some sort of amount of, levy-paying employers should spend about 50% of their levy on young people and new starters, so people who are genuinely trying to make a change. And that's a long-standing problem, but what it does is just ensures that, of the few vacancies that are currently out there, they go to people who very well might need it the most. Now, that's one thing, but that does nothing to address the fact that obviously I can't expect to see too many apprenticeship vacancies coming through the pipeline right now. And one of the things that we discussed a little bit in the event that we held yesterday, or the webinar that we held yesterday, I should say, which is probably a bit less ideal, but it's, government working with training providers and colleges to perhaps, create some sort of apprenticeships working with employers that, previously might not have existed. And honestly, what that looks like in practice, where the funding for that comes,
Sure.
We've just barely scratched the surface of it.
And, traditionally governments have looked at, for example, wage subsidy type schemes as a way of pricing young people into the labour market. But at the same time, we've also had bad experiences of that with things like the youth training scheme in the 1980s.
Exactly, yeah.
And I'm old enough to remember those times now.
Exactly.
Kathleen Henehan, Research and Policy Analyst at Resolution Foundation. Absolute pleasure talking to you this evening. Thank you for joining Skills World Live.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Bewick.
Our love before it's gone, and just like kids are cheating death, we lose our minds and hold our breaths and cut right through the glossy layers with no time for empty prayers. Always someone to defeat, but no surrender, no retreat.
Like Fire. That's by Rivera with Kelly Hawkes. Now to continue tonight's big debate. looking at the impact of the coronavirus on youth unemployment, I'm delighted to be joined by two sector experts. Stephen Isherwood, who's the Chief Executive at the Institute of Student Employers, the ISE, and Charlie Ball, who's Head of Higher Education Intelligence at Prospects. Good evening, chaps.
Good evening, Tom.
Good evening.
Good evening, Tom.
And that's Stephen. Let's start with you first, Stephen. Your organisation has been working with graduate-level employers, I think, since 1968. What kind of prospects do you envisage for the class of 2020 now it's becoming clear that the challenge of coronavirus is with us for a long time to come?
I think it's going to be a tough year. There's no disputing that. I think what we need to be careful of, though, is that we don't generalise about the whole labour market, because when we look at the employers that we work with, yes, there are some that are deferring some of their graduate offers. There are some that are saying they're going to recruit fewer graduates this year than they plan to. But then we have other organisations that have switched to online recruiting and are still recruiting actively. So I think there will be fewer graduate vacancies overall, but it's important to emphasise that it's a mixed bag. There are some sectors that are sort of still going full steam ahead.
Sure, I think that's a really strong point. And indeed, Kathleen Henehan, who I was just debating and discussing some of these points with before the break, made that point about even when you look at past recessions, whilst unemployment ticks up across the piece, graduates on the whole tend to obviously do better than non-graduates, and that in itself obviously creates some policy challenges for government. Charlie, apart from dealing with your sarcastic 11-year-old daughter, and don't worry, it's probably quite a few of our listeners will have one of those, including me, a recent survey by Prospect found that 26% of final year students had already lost their placement or internship, and a staggering 29% had lost their jobs. I mean, is there worse to come, do you think?
Well, looking at indicators from the various organisations who are tracking the job market quite closely at the moment, we are starting to get the sense that things are maybe bottomed out a little bit, particularly around Easter. We tend to see a slowdown in the jobs market anyway, and that was obviously greatly exacerbated by the effects of the virus. But that said, as Stephen says, and as we can see, the effect, and particularly on youth unemployment, and Kathleen's paper is very, very good on that, very strong on that. This cohort of new education leavers are graduating into a very, very difficult environment, and we also know from a lot of the information and data that we're getting that things like placement, things like internships, are being particularly badly affected. One of the things that Kathleen points out in her paper that's very interesting is a lot of the first steps on the employment ladder have been very badly affected, and graduates going into service sector roles and this kind of thing are suffering particularly. The reason why they're going into those service sector roles as a first option after graduation is because the roles they used to go into before the last recession, the office jobs, went in the last recession, and they've largely been automated out, and they haven't come back. And so those graduates who don't immediately start off well, and I use graduates here as a catch-all term for post-18 leavers, so it does include FE leavers as well. Those graduates who don't get a favourable outcome early are starting, as Kathleen points out, displace non-graduates from the labour market, starting lower down the ladder, because many of the better non-graduate roles went in the last recession, and are finding it hard to get out there. So there are a lot of concerning signs. But the other thing to point out is, as Stephen says, and Kathleen points out, graduates are likely to be the least affected group of educational leavers. There's rarely a case where having more qualifications is a disadvantage in the labour market, and actually that's more the case in a difficult labour market. And we also have to bear in mind that some sectors are significantly less seriously affected than others. I mean, if you're studying to be a nurse, for example, I shouldn't be too concerned about your job prospects.
No, not at the moment, that's for sure, and into the foreseeable future. I mean, Stephen, this idea of whether it's by government policy or whether it's just individual behaviour, but this idea of kind of riding out the storm to some extent by just expanding the places that are on offer both at further education level and indeed at university level. I mean, is that a realistic policy option, do you think, for governments? Should they just basically get the checkbook out and say to institutions, just provide places for young people so, 2 years or so they can use up doing hopefully productive learning, and this whole thing could be over by then?
I think there's some merit in that argument, because we do want people to make productive use of their time, and I wonder if there's more of an argument at the FE level than maybe the graduate level. It's a real difficult one, because there's lots of evidence that doing further study, exactly as Charlie said, further study doesn't hinder you in the job market. I think when it comes to postgraduate study, it's a very mixed bag, because there are very few employers that really place a premium on a postgraduate qualification. Very few recruit by degree subject, let alone a master's qualification. Now, some industries, you need it. You need it to progress, but that's a very small percentage of the jobs market.
That's interesting.
So I think if you're a student thinking about doing an extra qualification, it really pays to look at the jobs you're thinking of doing, looking actually how a master's qualification might enhance your job prospects or how it may not do. And if it doesn't, maybe there are better ways to spend your time, and more cost-effective ways to spend your time than doing that postgraduate qualification. I mean, if you want to go and study a subject for the love of it, that's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. I would never argue against that. But I don't think that it's a mistake to automatically assume that a master's qualification makes you more employable.
Yeah.
Too many employers, rightly or wrongly, treat master's students exactly the same as graduates. And you may have increased your sort of the amount of debt you're holding for that privilege.
Well, that's a real interesting observation, because I have to say that's slightly counterintuitive to what I've sort of often thought, is that the master's degree gives you a slight edge in the labour market, but it seems from what you're saying is that it really depends on what kind of occupational route you're going into as to whether or not it does give you that competitive edge, by the sounds of it. Is that right, Stephen?
Absolutely. So let's say, for example, you are going to be a journalist. I mean, nowadays to get into journalism, you need a master's in journalism. Right. My background before I did this job, I worked in big four accountancy firms, and yes, we recruited master's students, but we treated them no differently at all to graduates. And for most employers, yes, qualifications are important because they show a level of academic achievement, but it's everything else that you bring to the equation. Grades alone and qualifications alone do not get you the job. It's the other stuff as well, that make that job offer come through.
Yeah. Charlie, do you think that government as well is just going to have to accept that it may have to become, to some extent, I say employer of last resort, it sounds sort of desperate, but historically, and you can go right back to the Great Depression, you can look at some of the active labour market policies of the 1980s, the ones that, particularly the ones that work well in places like Germany and Scandinavia. I mean, the government did sort of take a view, or those governments took a view that we're just not going to let young people waste away on a life on sort of unemployment benefits. We're going to create, not necessarily make work schemes, but we are going to be very active and give them a series of other job guarantees, apprenticeship guarantees. If they want to go off and learn, just for the sake of it for a year or two, that's not so bad either, and the government will pay for it, or we all will as taxpayers. I mean, could you see, by this time next year, the makings of those kind of programs and schemes coming into daily usage?
It's a very live debate, Tom, and the government does have some very difficult choices. There's no question that coming up, and this is one. There's no question that youth unemployment is going to go up, and quite possibly go up very, very significantly, very, very rapidly, and in a way that may, with linked with structural changes to the labour, possible structural changes to the labour market, that might make it very, very difficult for some of these young people to ever break into a decent career, particularly those with lower qualification levels. And so there's a very strong argument to be said that rather than have them sitting collecting benefits and not getting anything particularly productive out of that for themselves or in social and economic terms, why not put something in place to guarantee a level of education? I think the question is, how would that education be delivered, who would deliver it, and what would that be? And it links in with one of our big issues in this whole sphere, which is we've not got brilliant data on demand. And because we don't have brilliant data for demand, often policies that are designed to stimulate supply don't necessarily always meet where demand actually is.
Yeah, that's right. You get into the kind of training without jobs paradox, don't you, if you're not careful? Yeah.
That's right. And you get into very difficult situations where a lot of money is spent on training people for roles that don't really exist or are about to go obsolete, or you neglect some forms of very useful training in favour of heavily lobbied forms of training that are you're essentially subsidising wealthy industries who are good at lobbying.
Yeah,
and I think there's a danger of that happening, and we have to be quite vigilant to avoid that taking place at this point. We've got a very rapidly moving labour market. We have an unknown but likely very changeable situation coming up, and the best form of training we should be able to give young people is quite a general set of skills that should allow them to navigate a whole range of potential scenarios. Nobody really knows what's coming down the highway, and so training people for quite specific scenarios is likely to leave at least some of them with expensive and largely useless training.
Yeah, well, we've been there before, so let's hope that doesn't happen again.
We have.
Stephen, the last word to you, though. We've only got a minute left in this segment. I mean, your organisation historically obviously worked with employers, large employers, graduate recruiters. I think in my day, and it shows my age now, it used to be called the annual milk round. No idea if that terminology is still used. But, what do you think will be this summer the attitude of employers when it comes to taking on a sort of pipeline of talent from our universities? Are they just going to be very risk averse, or will it end completely, or just will it be very competitive and selective?
Oh, I think that's a really hard question, and I've got enough grey hairs to still use the term milk round as well.
By the way, I have no idea what that actually related to. Perhaps you could enlighten me.
Apparently to do the cream of the crops, when it was told, that's where it came from, that's what you're after. And I think it's because you got up early to go around all the universities, but apparently it was the cream of the crop of where it came from. Yeah. And interesting, lots of employers are talking about going virtual on campuses this autumn because recognising that there just won't be much activity or much appetite for doing stuff face to face. I really hesitate to generalise because I think it is a very mixed bag. And from our employers, we have employers who are still taking on their placement students. They're getting them working virtually. They're delivering laptops to their homes. They're paying them. They're getting on the books. And we have other employers that are just having to scale right back because they just can't get people in the buildings, or if they're in a sector that's being decimated by this crisis. Sure. So I think actually we have to look at it sector by sector and which employers in certain sectors, are robust with strong balance sheets that are going to survive as well. My sense of the bigger employers is this year they are sticking as much as they can with the people they've hired already. Right. They want to keep that commitment. I think one of the things we also need to think about is the lag of all this. Yeah. So actually, if it takes a long time to come out of, if we're still in recession next year, actually that's when employers just won't hire next year. Maybe the graduates from this year will have taken those roles. So I think we've got to be really careful of the long term with this.
Absolutely.
Can I interject there for a moment?
10 seconds, Charlie.
we're hearing from employers who are already saying that they've taken such a hit to their balance sheets this year that it will affect recruitment next year. So Stephen's absolutely right.
Yeah, indeed. And that was reflected, I think, in the Prospects survey. Charlie Ball, who was just talking there, Head of Higher Education Intelligence at Prospects, now part of GISC, of course, and Stephen Isherwood, who's Chief Executive at the Institute of Student Employers. Fascinating debate. Thanks for joining Skills World Live.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Bewick.
I was knocked down, heard the countdown through the haze, in the face of defeat, I was ruled out with no bailout, on my own, all alone, left to bleed out. But I rose up from the ground, just like about to explode.
No, I don't have to say I'm sorry. I ain't staying in the background, no, 'cause I don't need your worry. I'm a movement and I ain't losing. Gonna go, 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 go. Like a bullet, won't take no bullshit. You should know, no, I'm about to explode.
About to Explode by Daxton. So to finish off tonight's big debate theme on youth unemployment and what we might expect to see over the coming months as a result of COVID-19, I'm delighted to be joined on the line by Louise Woodruff, who's the Policy and Partnerships Manager at Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and also Paul Convery, who's a councillor at the London Borough of Islington. Good evening, both.
Hi, Tom.
Hello there, Tom.
Hi there. Paul, let's start with you first. I remember the pioneering work you did at the unemployment unit all those years ago, so you've seen the impact of downturns and unemployment for young people in all its guises. As someone representing an inner London borough, what worries you the most about the current crisis and its potential impact on youth unemployment?
Well, you're right, Tom. Remembering the early 80s, I'm extremely apprehensive about the next few months. There are one or two sort of silver linings. The early 80s was a catastrophic recession. It was, as you said at the top of the programme, it was the recession which led to the whole generation of the Youth Opportunities Programme, YTS, and a whole suite of very discredited programmes. And what happened in the early 80s, which caused this sort of deep scarring memory, was there was a recession and there was a baby boom. So there was a peak of 18-year-olds hitting the labour market around about 1983-84. Fortunately, that isn't happening at the moment because the number of young people is declining slightly. So that's one silver lining, but it's the only one, I think, presently. My anxiety right throughout the country, as Kathleen's report shows, the young people always get hit badly every recession, with or without the demographic factors. And what we do know is that young people have tended to go into what now appear to be extremely vulnerable sectors. I mean, paradoxically, retail, transport, hospitality, recreation, entertainment, personal services, these were meant to be the growth sectors. And to be fair, they have been for the best part of a couple of decades. Suddenly, they just fall off the edge of a cliff because people will not want to use or purchase those services. So the disproportionate impact of young people working in those vulnerable sectors is on a massive scale.
Absolutely.
The thing that I particularly observe is this. The last 10 years, and hey, I'm not going to be too partisan, but the last 10 years have seen the presumption of economic growth at a time when real wages didn't improve particularly, when precarious work really expanded, and when all of the infrastructure that we used to have over decades around the labour market has been dismantled. So all of those job entry services, job broking, pre-employment training, Job Centre Plus has practically disappeared as an institution and been replaced by a very, very loose and very fragmented set of services which have become designed only for the most disadvantaged. And suddenly there's the possibility that maybe 800,000 or 900,000 young people will be unemployed within a few months from now. And so that system absolutely ain't fit for purpose, and that's got to be fixed for a start.
Yeah, well, let's drill down into that in a few moments, perhaps. But Louise, we talked earlier, on this programme about the impact of COVID-19 on graduates, and that's really about the 50% of under 25-year-olds that currently go to university. But of course, what about the other 50%? And I know, a lot of the focus of your work and at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation is about in-work poverty, and frankly, those that have never been anywhere near a university. I mean, what do you see happening to those who, frankly, too often get trapped in that cycle already, of unemployment and low-paid, precarious work?
Yes, that's right. So we know, our latest figures show that there are about 4 million workers in poverty, and around 14 million people altogether in the UK. So that was before this crisis started. And we know that means a lot for individual young people in terms of not being able to take part fully in social activities, stitching jobs together, affects their well-being, both their mental and physical well-being, and sort of relentless battle really to cope with household bills and sort of the day-to-day. So we know that already has a harmful effect on young people. And we also see that work has not provided a route out of poverty, not just for young people, but for lots of people in particularly in low-paid work in the labour market. And we've seen also in this crisis that we have seen this bigger focus on people who are key workers, who are skilled but are in low-paid sectors and have been going out to work. And that will include lots of young people too. And we need to remember that contribution that they're already making within the kind of response to the crisis. But if we look at some of those sectors that we've already mentioned around hospitality, non-food retail, there are already, workers in those areas do have higher rates of poverty already. And now they're also facing, obviously, being put on furlough, which has been a really welcome scheme to retain jobs. But we really need to make sure that scheme, the job retention scheme, continues to support workers, including young people, that it's becomes more flexible. So it's great to see the extension and greater flexibility that the Chancellor announced today.
Yeah.
And we need to remember those are, it's really important that scheme continues to support the young people already in work. Mm-hmm. But we probably will need a whole range of solutions to address what will be an increase in unemployment for young people inevitably as we hit this recession.
Paul, on social media today, talking of the job retention scheme, you sort of referenced, I think in a tweet, that it was a sort of form of a basic income scheme, perhaps quite an expensive one. On that point, do you think it was right to extend the job retention scheme, or do you think some sort of kind of active labour market policies, which I think was probably what you were hinting at in that tweet, might be more effective?
Well,
is it just kicking the can down the road of sort of 3 million unemployed? Don't know they're unemployed yet.
The thing is, the job retention scheme has just been essential. The whole lockdown phase. Leave aside why we ended up in a lockdown of such length and it has to be prolonged, but it's quite clear that when the decision was taken to just basically stop the economy on a sixpence, something had to be done at almost any expense. What it has done is it's shone a spotlight on, when the chips are down and the money can be found. 8 billion or 9 billion pounds per month is an awful lot of money. Now, I think that there needs to be a tapering off of the job retention scheme if and when it will naturally taper off, I hope, as those businesses start to rebuild and have the revenue to pay their workers directly from the business income. The question is, ought we not be using perhaps just a small fraction of £8 billion per month to then make sure that we don't have a recurrence of the sort of structural unemployment which is absolutely inevitable? Because even if the majority of jobs return to some kind of normality, the extent of change in the labour market is going to be absolutely massive. It's not just the vulnerable sectors, it seems to me. I think there is a big change, a mood change in the country about basically, how have we run things for the last several decades? I mean, who are the highest status occupations until just a few weeks ago? There were lawyers and bankers and media executives. And there's not a populistic rant, but
we know who the key workers are now, don't we? And actually,
exactly. Yeah. Turns out they're the people that do caring, supply services, shop workers, bin. So I think that's a big. Just a big shift in attitude.
It is a massive wake-up call, isn't it? And Louise, I mean, your foundation over the years has, really shone a light on those what we now call so-called key workers, or on the critical list of essential workers that have not been so affected by some of the physical distancing restrictions. But final word to you. I mean, how do you see things playing out now for those that, as we've discussed already, already in the precarious labour market? I mean, incomes after the last financial crisis, we're talking over a decade ago, were only slightly sort of starting to edge up in more recent years, particularly for those at the lower end of the labour market, with a combination of minimum wage and living wage rate increases. I mean, do you see all that coming to just a shuddering halt now, because employers can look at frankly, a reserve army of labour and say, well, sorry, we're not going to increase wages?
Yeah, well, that is a risk, but I think that's why we should, in a way, double down on our efforts to continue with some of those moves to improve quality of work. So we were starting to see a real focus before this crisis on good work across those, and particularly in those sectors which traditionally have been more low paid. So I think it's really important that we don't lose the progress that we've made, and we do go back to those things around job quality, around hours, progression, training, security, making employers actually investing properly in skills, not just at the top of the income spectrum, but for their lower paid workers as well. Yeah. So we need to have that, as well as the kind of big ticket items that we're going to need to make a difference to unemployment, both for young people and other people in the labour market as well. And we mustn't forget, I think, that the levelling up agenda that we were talking about
remember that.
A lot after Christmas and after the election, that hasn't gone away.
No.
And thinking about those, particularly those weaker economies that have been weaker before this crisis, and also some of the solutions we were thinking about in terms of skills investment, infrastructure investment, that's important too. And we need to go back to think about how those can provide solutions, particularly for young people.
Alas, we've ran out of time, and you're quite right. The agenda, whether it's levelling up or the debate about low pay, precarious unemployment, about who the key workers are, that's not going to go away anytime soon. Thanks to you both, Paul Convery and Louise Woodruff. Thank you very much for joining Skills World Live.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you.
Tom.
Bye.
You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Bewick. Great debate this evening. So this track's called Morning Rises by Arai, and it actually reminds me of something that Eleanor Roosevelt once said. With the new day comes new strength and new thoughts. Let's hold on to that, shall we? On tomorrow's Skills World Live, we'll be asking, in the future, will the British economy rely on having more scientists or creatives? Is it either or? Let's find out tomorrow. If you want to be on the show, don't forget to email us at skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. And a big thanks, as ever, to the show's editor, Kelly O'Mara, and our digital producer, Ellie Hansen. Skills World Live is an FE News production supported by the Federation of Awarding Bodies Platinum Partners Programme. You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Bewick. News, views and interviews in association with FE News.